This video will be focusing on a video game that revolves around subjects such as suicide, sexual assault, and pedophilia. Even though there will be no visual depictions of those things, there will be a description of a specific suicide scene for the sake of context. I will give a warning right before that part of the video, but if this subject is likely to upset you, or act as a trigger, I highly recommend that you turn this video off now. I promise that the next one will be about something a little less serious. Also, spoilers for The Suicide of Rachel Foster and The Missing, J.J. Macfield and the Island of Memories. When I think about sex in films and video games, I often tend to think about the 2003 film The Matrix Reloaded, where Kung Fu man with cardboard personality Neo has sex with his cardboard Kung Fu partner Trinity. It's not very clear why they are a couple though, except that in the first film there was this character named the Oracle who told Trinity that she would find the Messiah, or the One, because she would fall in love with him. This pays off in the end of the film when Neo dies and Trinity brings him back with the power of a kiss. But their relationship feels more like a contractual obligation more than anything else, because the chemistry between these two characters, or rather the lack of chemistry, barely changes in the sequel. So when they decide to bang during the first half of Matrix Reloaded, it feels a lot like an attempt to convince you that they're in a genuine relationship without actually fleshing it out. But it doesn't really work, because we don't know these characters any better afterwards, and the supposed love that saved Neo in the first film is still very unconvincing. I think that this scene is emblematic of a lot of sex scenes in media. Yeah, they're having sex. People who like having sex with each other usually do that, but what does it bring to the narrative? Do you really need a sex scene to help the audience understand the relationship between characters? Does it move the plot forward? What makes it so essential that it just has to be shown? You might say that it's unfair of me to use this particular film to represent most sex scenes because, like I said before, these characters have almost zero chemistry. But if Neo and Trinity would have had better chemistry, if it was clear to us just by looking at them that they have really deep romantic feelings for each other, wouldn't a sex scene be even less necessary? Like, have you ever watched a film and thought to yourself that this really needed a sex scene? Everything else was perfect, but it just needed that sex scene to tie everything together. I get that some people are just horny, and watching a sex scene might be the closest thing to watching pornography starring Hollywood actors they're really attracted to. But if we're talking about how it serves the narrative, well, characters kissing takes seconds. A sex scene can take a minute or even minutes, but you can potentially gather the same information about the characters from both. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that no film or video game or whatever should ever contain sex scenes, but a lot of the time they feel more like interruptions rather than vital parts of a story. It may fit stories that are partially or mainly about sex, like the Netflix show Sex Education, where the sex is less about the eroticism and more about the characters' insecurities surrounding that eroticism, and how they deal with and eventually overcome their insecurities. But I generally believe that stories would probably benefit from implying these things rather than showing them. You've probably heard the phrase show don't tell, but the truth is that showing isn't always better than telling. And some things should definitely not be shown. The Suicide of Rachel Foster is a video game that released February 19th, 2020, and it's, without hyperbole, one of the most reprehensible video games I've ever played. I don't think the developers were deliberately malicious. It's not a game like Hatred or Postal that seems to have been created with the sole intention of upsetting people. The developers at 101 Games aren't trying to push people away, or trying to speak to a specific demographic of edgy teens. They're trying to pull in as many people as possible. The title, The Suicide of Rachel Foster, is a sales pitch, and pretty big red flag too. It purposefully tries to grab your attention by putting its uncomfortable subject matter front and center. It immediately evokes a reaction, which is great for a small indie developer who is trying to stick out from the crowd, but it's also kind of tasteless. Even more so when you realize exactly how the game treats the topic of suicide. The only title that might have been more exploitative would have been the sexual abuse of Rachel Foster, and the really horrible part is that the title would still fit. You play as Nicole Wilson, who has driven to the family-owned Timber Lane Hotel to inspect and sell it on her deceased mother's request. If you've ever seen the 1980 horror film The Shining, entering this place will feel overly familiar almost immediately. Everything from the cold mountain setting to the colors and patterns on the hotel walls and carpets feel like they've been ripped straight from the Overlook. This also creates a reaction, or rather an expectation. But just like in the 2013 game Gone Home, another one of the game's obvious influences, looks can very much be deceiving. Even though it appears so, you're not actually in a horror story, or at least not the kind of horror story that you might think. There's no Jack Torrance to stalk you through a snow-covered maze. Instead, we have Leonard McGrath, Nicole's other deceased parent. What would eventually lead to Rachel Foster's supposed suicide all started with her having an affair with Leonard. When she was 9 weeks pregnant, the whole thing was exposed. Leonard's wife Claire left him and the hotel with Nicole, and Rachel, again supposedly, took her own life in shame. Rachel Foster was 16 years old, and Leonard was her 40-something-year-old tutor. And if you think that's a big yikes, we're just getting started. During the game, Nicole receives frequent calls from a FEMA agent named Irving, who assists her while she's trying to piece together what really happened to Rachel. Clues have been scattered all around the hotel, almost as if someone had deliberately put them there for Nicole to find. This turns out to be completely accurate when it's revealed that Irving isn't in fact a FEMA agent at all, but Rachel's brother, who put the whole thing together with Leonard before he died, so that Nicole could one day figure out the truth of Rachel's death, even though both of them already had everything they needed to figure it out for themselves. So why put Nicole through all of this? Well, you see, Nicole actually hated Rachel when they were kids. She was jealous that she was so well liked, especially by Leonard. Irving's reasoning is that if Nicole had cared about Rachel like he did, then maybe they could have stopped Rachel from dying. The predatory acts of her father? No, that was, in Irving's own words, simply a love. Nothing more, nothing less. The problem, apparently, wasn't that Leonard got a 16-year-old girl pregnant, but that they were judged for it. It's like an unironic reverse of Silent Hill 2. Irving and Leonard from Beyond the Grave emotionally manipulated and abused Nicole to solve a crime she not only didn't remember committing, but that she didn't commit at all. If it was clear as day that these characters were supposed to be seen as antagonists, the twist still wouldn't have been good, but at least it would have been acceptable. But the huge problem here is that the game clearly wants you to sympathize with, or at least consider the viewpoint of a pedophile and the victim's complacent brother. It's one thing that Nicole is wearing rose-tinted glasses. She was a kid when it all happened, and in spite of everything, Leonard was her dad, and she loved him. But even though the player can clearly see what's really happening, the game never acknowledges how incredibly fucked up it is that Leonard not only groomed and impregnated an underage girl, he also manipulated her brother into believing that it was right, and that it would be worth throwing away the rest of his life to defend. When the truth is finally revealed, that it was Nicole's mother who murdered Rachel out of jealousy, again, over a 16-year-old girl, Irving leaves the hotel that he had been secretly staying in all this time and walks straight out into the snow to take his own life, like Leonard before him. Never in my life did I ever expect that I would be playing a video game that was deliberately or even mistakenly pro-pedophilia. But there I was, earlier this year, playing The Suicide of Rachel Foster with my fucking jaw through the floor. I tried to find any interview where the developers explain what their actual intentions were, and I could only find one, where the developer, that seems to be unnamed, had this to say.
The Suicide of Rachel Foster is a work of fiction developed to encourage players to think critically about this type of behavior while simultaneously analyzing the various tragic events and array of painful emotions that such a tragedy could create. We tried our best to depict these themes from a variety of perspectives, thus allowing our players to feel strong emotions and analyze the reality of the situation for themselves. Unfortunately, people are capable of atrocious, monstrous acts, and this is something we wanted to explore, given the incredible power of video games as a communicative medium. Our intention in this was not to justify Leonard's actions, but rather to explore how a deep affection towards a person can often emotionally blind a person into subconsciously justifying such questionable behavior.
Just starting the response by saying that something is fiction, like that would be enough of a justification, already gives off a bad vibe. The developer then makes it pretty clear that they put a lot more responsibility on the player to criticize the game's subject matter than on themselves. So it might not be very surprising then when the lack of proper outspoken criticism in the game's script results in people maybe believing that you're endorsing Leonard's behavior, or at least that you feel indifferent about it, which, let's face it, just comes off as an indirect endorsement. During the 3 hours it took for me to play through this game to the end, I don't think I heard anyone say the word pedophile out loud in conversation even once, which very much feels like an attempt to dance around the issue, since the grooming of a minor is the catalyst for the entire plot. When Irving describes the relationship between Leonard and Rachel as simply a love, Nicole has an opportunity, clear as day, to interject, but chooses not to. If the developers really wanted to depict a variety of perspectives, this might have been the most important part of the whole game to do it. But Nicole stays silent, and then the moment slips by. But at the very least, the developers had the decency not to portray pedophilia and sexual assault visually. The closest thing we get are a couple of drawings of Rachel posing naked that are hidden in Leonard's secret room in the hotel attic. It's extremely gross to even have that in the game, but at least we don't have to watch a scene from when they were drawn. Sadly, they didn't have the same kind of restraint about the subject matter the game was named after. I will not show you how The Suicide of Rachel Foster ends. I straight up refuse. But to let you know just how god-awful the ending really is, and why the game truly fails in its mission to talk about suicide in a respectable manner, I will use the words of Rock Paper Shotgun writer Alice Bell to describe it. If you don't want to hear it, this is your final chance to stop the video. You ready? Here we go.
A black screen clears to reveal Nicole sitting in the front of her car, with a piece of pipe taped through the window, and you have to turn the engine on, and then either turn it off again or sit in the fumes until Nicole dies. Seems like Rachel is the only one who didn't commit suicide after all. The content warning at the start is necessary then, but not because the game discusses suicide frankly or sensitively or in a meaningful way, but because you can actually do it. The scene isn't even earned through what the game does up until that moment. It just happens.
Now I know what you're thinking. How could the game possibly get any worse than this? It literally ends with forcing you into taking part in an on-screen suicide attempt. Well, what if I told you that even though the game gives you the choice to stop, it is actually kind of encouraging the player to let it all play out. Because if you save yourself, Nicole's mind suddenly snaps, and she starts having delusions about staying at the hotel with her dead family. So the choice boils down to ending it all immediately, or letting Nicole play out an unhealthy fantasy that will most likely result in her dying alone in that abandoned hotel anyway. Not since the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why have I seen such a bafflingly poor depiction of suicide in any kind of media. This is like the sex scene from Matrix Reloaded, only 100 times worse. When there is an unnecessary sex scene containing consenting parties, The worst thing that might happen is that it might grind the pacing of a story to a halt. Having a badly implemented suicide scene, on the other hand, can actually have some really serious, real-life consequences. Specifically something called suicide contagion, which means that if someone is already in a very dark place, and are considering taking their own life, there is a risk that watching or reading about somebody else who's done it can be enough to make them go through with it themselves, especially if the method is described in detail. Does that remind you of a certain video game? There's probably no objectively best way to portray suicide or suicidal people, because everyone reacts differently when faced with disturbing subject matters. Some people have no problem whatsoever watching exploitative rape and revenge films like I Spit on Your Grave, while others might not even feel comfortable playing a video game where the act of rape is only implied. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't at least try to make something that works for everyone, because again, the potential consequences of screwing it up are just too severe to ignore. That's why the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention made a very useful list of recommendations for how to depict suicide in media, which includes the following.
Convey that suicide is complex and often caused by a range of factors, rather than by a single event. Show that help is available. Portray characters with suicidal thoughts who do not go on to die by suicide. Portray everyday characters who can be a lifeline. Consult with suicide prevention messaging experts and people with personal experience. Depict the grieving and healing process of people who lose someone to suicide. Use non-judgmental language.
And of course,
avoid showing or describing the details about suicide methods.
While looking at this list, it almost feels like 101 Games for some reason went out of their way to not check a single one of the boxes. All of the major players in the story of the suicide of Rachel Foster attempt to or have already taken their own lives, and they all did it because of one single incident that unified them all. There are no lifeline characters. Because again, almost all characters are dead from the start, and those who are still alive die later. And if Nicole has any supportive friends, or any kind of friends at all, they're not present to help. We see and hear about the characters grieving, but we never hear or see any healing because, again, everybody chose death and or didn't recover, and I imagine that if the developers had talked to any suicide prevention experts, or with people with personal experience, these issues wouldn't have been in the final product. Then again, consulting is never a guarantee that developers will actually use the advice they get. When reviewers critique games by asking why is thing like this without actually trying to answer that question themselves, I usually feel that they don't really have a leg to stand on. That you have questions about a piece of media can be proof that the media is bad, but if you, as a reviewer, don't even try to explain why, it just comes off as deliberate ignorance. So maybe I'm a bit of a hypocrite, because I don't know why the developers of The Suicide of Rachel Foster decided to end the game with an interactive suicide scene. As Alice Bell points out, it comes out of the fucking blue. It's almost as if the developers thought to themselves that, well, everyone else is dead at this point, so let's just kill off Nicole as well. But then I found in the previously mentioned interview that the developer had an explanation for this creative choice as well.
In regards to the finale, we felt that it would be more coherent with the themes in the game to present players with a controversial decision, rather than remove an intriguing game mechanic.
But the scene doesn't really provide any thematic resolution. Only the irony that everyone except the character that was said to have committed suicide actually went through with it. And that just comes off as some sick joke more than anything else. The real answer is right there though, because it was controversial. The game was just in need of a shocking finale, and this one sure fit the bill. And this might be a translation error or something, but what exactly do they mean by rather than remove an intriguing game mechanic? If this developer was seriously trying to say that killing yourself is an intriguing game mechanic in the context of this game, I'm absolutely speechless. But I will give them the benefit of the doubt here, because that claim would be absolutely ludicrous. One of the saddest things about all of this though, And perhaps the biggest reason why this game just completely falls apart is that even though the game is named after her, we never get to hear or read Rachel Foster's perspective. She never gets a voice of her own. Everything that we learn about her is told to us by the people who knew her. She is the most important character in all of the other characters' lives, and she's the most important character in the entire plot. But she's never humanized. The literal pedophile gets to explain himself, but not the young girl whose life was ruined because of his unethical and predatory actions. Rachel Foster only gets to be a name. A face on a poster, with some really bad associations. Now that we have gotten all of that out of the way, let's compare this horrible game with one that approaches the subject of suicide in a better way, or at least one that tries to. The Missing, J.J. Macfield and the Island of Memories, was my favorite game of 2018. And I kinda want to tell you to play it before watching this part, but I honestly think that the game is better when you know what it all means. The titular character JJ is a trans woman, who is stuck in a sort of dreamlike limbo after having tried to commit suicide. Throughout the game, JJ has to literally sacrifice her body and limbs to clear all of the game's various puzzles. But regardless of how severe her injuries get, she can always regain those limbs, heal herself, and keep going. The game does depict the act of suicide visually, and yes, it does force you to go through with it yourself. But, and this is a very big but, even though I still feel that it didn't need to be shown, this isn't where the story ends. During the game, JJ has been trying to flee from the physical manifestations of all of the various things that brought her to wanting to take her own life in the first place. And eventually, she just can't take it anymore. In her mind, not even her best friend Emily is left to support her anymore. But then, a text message. You're not done. You have to save Emily. In the end, JJ chooses life because she realizes that there are people that both accept and need her just as much as she needs them. And while I am personally getting more and more tired of the trend where stories about being trans in a lot of cases are solely about the difficulties of being trans, which I also made a video about, as a story about suicide, it's a lot more mindful of the recommendations provided by the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention than the suicide of Rachel Foster is. But yeah, even in this case the game could have worked perfectly even without showing a suicide attempt. I might be Captain Obvious here, but context and tone most definitely makes a difference when depicting suicide. In the 2019 game After Party, for example, there are a bunch of hanged people dangling by one of the shores in hell. Yeah, literal hell. However, they're talking to you, as if they're having a regular day at the office. The imagery might be disturbing, but the humor deflates the dramatic aspect. Does that mean that visual depictions of suicide can actually work well? I don't think that there's a clear yes or no answer to that. But just like with sex scenes, I've never thought to myself that a piece of media needed a suicide scene, where the act is shown with all its gruesome details. To me, it's one thing to show a character who has already done the deed, and another thing entirely to not only depict the deed, but also letting you be the one who commits it. One is a depiction of death, a corpse, while the other is a depiction of a living, breathing human being who is about to make a choice that will be devastating, not only to themselves, but to everyone around them who has ever cared for or loved them. And that is something you don't treat casually. To bring it all back to the start of this video, I think that storytellers need to consider how a scene that visually depicts suicide serves the narrative, just like they need to consider the necessity of a sex scene, or any other kind of scene, really. Does the audience really need to watch it happen to understand what the character is going through? Is it that essential that it just has to be shown? YouTuber Dan Olsen of Folding Ideas fame made a video in March 2020 about how he, along with a noticeable amount of other Netflix users, used the 2011 film Contagion as a way to cope with the continuous spread of the coronavirus. He explains how watching the film and facing all of his emotions surrounding the COVID crisis head on was actually kind of cathartic for him. It's probably for similar reasons that Ryan and Amy Green wanted to make the 2016 game That Dragon Cancer, as a way to cope with the real-life death of their son. It's like how we tend to listen to sad music when we feel sad. It feels validating. But there is a difference between validation and exploitation. And if video game developers like 101 Games, or anyone who's writing stories really, want to talk about suicide in a sensitive way, they're gonna have to understand that distinction. And it might actually be as easy as the difference between a kiss and a sex scene. There's a clear focus on horror-related stuff on this channel, and I think it would be wrong of me not to address the fact that horror is supposed to be shocking and uncomfortable, and maybe even a little bit tasteless. So how come that, for example, people murdering each other in horror games is fine, while people murdering themselves isn't? It's true that horror often portrays the worst possible acts that people can commit on each other, murder being one of them. And it's equally true that a lot of people, for some bizarre reason, get a kick out of watching that kind of stuff. Me, obviously included. And I can only really speak for myself here, but I feel that murder in games can be an effective way of raising the stakes, especially in certain kinds of horror games. I mean, you wanna live, right? You want to get the person you're playing as to the end, and dying against your will is just another scary thing among the, hopefully, many scary things a game can use to get that sweet adrenaline pumping. Although I do think that video games in general have trivialized death in such a way that it has been reduced to an often basic and almost inconsequential game mechanic. It can be such an insignificant setback that people sometimes commit suicide in video games for comedic purposes, just to see what happens, to see how far the character model will flail away after being blown up by some explosive barrels, for example. That can be fun, for a variety of reasons. But maybe most of all because it's without major consequences. And kind of like in After Party, that really deflates the dramatic aspect of it all. But just because killing and being killed in video games have been normalized to the point where it's what you do in most video games ever, that doesn't mean that pre-planned scenes of suicide need to be normalized as well. But that's just what I think. And like I said before, there probably are a lot of people who could handle a scene like the one in The Suicide of Rachel Foster a lot better than me. So, is this a problem that can actually be fixed? Well, the recommendations from the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention are definitely helpful, but clearly they're not always being used. Some people will make things that they themselves don't perceive to be offensive, while others will try to do it deliberately. There's one thing that everyone can and should do, though, and that's to get a lot better at putting content and trigger warnings at the beginning of their games. Or even on the box or on the store page, because companies like the ESRB or PEGI are clearly not doing enough. Some might dismiss this as some new snowflake SJW bullshit, but I mean, remember this? This is a content warning from the very first Silent Hill game, a game that was released 21 years ago. This is nothing new. Hell, they're almost synonymous with the whole survival horror genre, but they are in need of an improvement. Because even though 2 decades have passed, the content warning for The Suicide of Rachel Foster is just as vague as the one in Silent Hill. If not more so. Like, what does sensitive subjects even mean? Yeah, the game has the word suicide in the title, so one could guess, but just calling it sensitive subjects doesn't specify the amount of subjects, what they are, or why they're worth warning about. Because, you know, there is a pretty huge difference between characters talking about the subject of suicide and letting the player decide if the protagonist should take their own life or not. Also, if you're struggling with personal issues, again, the developers are probably referring to personal issues that are causing suicidal thoughts, but why not just write that? I'm struggling with a bunch of personal issues. Everyone has personal issues. But none of my current issues are causing me to have suicidal thoughts. At least 101 Games knew to put a content warning in there, but it ultimately does nothing to soften the blow of what's to come, because I guess they didn't want to spoil their shocking ending before the game even starts. But what sounds better? That a player might be able to figure out when and where the scene might play out beforehand, or that they go in without having any idea what the game will ask of them, and then have an experience that might do them real-life harm. To clarify, to make a content warning that's of any actual use, you have to state what the sensitive subjects are and what specific things might trigger a harmful emotional response. And yes, recommending hotlines and professional help is also good. So 101 did that right at least. I've given the suicide of Rachel Foster a lot of shit in this video, and I do believe that it was all very well deserved, but I think it's worth pointing out that there is actually some value with this game. Some video games are prime examples of how to do things like story and certain kinds of gameplay right. The suicide of Rachel Foster, on the other hand, is a prime example of what you, as a developer, should never do. Ever. And even though that's some really harsh criticism, that still means that this game serves a truly valuable purpose. I of course would have preferred if this game didn't exist at all, but it does. And the best thing that we can do about that is to learn from its mistakes. And now that we have all of that out of the way, I can finally uninstall this game for good. There. Much better. Thank you all so much for watching. This video would not have been made if it weren't for the people who support me on Patreon. And I want to give a special thanks to Nichtschwert, Sindri Orben. I've instinctively been using your online username for the past couple of videos, I'm sorry about that. Tobias Mattsson, and Håvard Krugerud. If you want to become a patron as well, you will not only help this channel stay afloat, you also get to see all future videos earlier, and you get access to the Discord server. I also want to give a huge thanks to the lovely people who provided their voices for this video. So in order of appearance, I'd like to thank Ragnarox, Eurothug4000, and Professor Flowers. I honestly didn't believe that any of you would actually say yes to doing this, but I feel incredibly honored that you did. If you, for some reason, haven't checked out their channels, you can find their links in the description. Lastly, I'd like to thank Arkrat, the beautiful boy who's not only a great voice actor and storyteller, but also really good at telling me how to write stuff in English well. You'll find his links in the description as well. And I think that it almost goes without saying at this point, but if you're having thoughts about committing suicide, talk to your friends and family. Find out what kind of help you can get from where you live. Whether it's from a helpline or a therapist. The important thing is that you don't isolate yourself from other people, because there are people who can help. And they want to.